Good evening. Tonight we begin with 2,000 military trucks that are going nowhere. On November 3rd, 2024, at precisely 6:47 a.m. local time, Belarusian border guards at the Krasnoe checkpoint, the primary crossing point between Russia and Belarus along the M1 highway, stopped a convoy of Russian military vehicles attempting to enter Belarus and told them to turn around. Not a single vehicle, not a dozen trucks. 2,000 military vehicles, heavy transport trucks carrying ammunition, armored personnel carriers, mobile artillery systems, fuel tankers, and command vehicles stretching back along the Russian side of the border for 43 kilometers. The convoy had been pre-authorized through normal military cooperation channels. Russian commanders had notified their Belarusian counterparts weeks in advance. Everything had been arranged through the protocols that have governed Russian-Belarusian military coordination for 3 decades. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko personally ordered the border closed. Think about that. Russia's closest ally, the leader who owed his political survival to Russian intervention just 4 years ago, the man Putin called "my brother" in a televised address last March, physically blocked Russian military forces from entering his territory. Here's the first hook. This isn't a bureaucratic delay over paperwork or a temporary dispute about transit fees. This is Belarus, the country that served as Russia's launching pad for the invasion of Ukraine, the nation that allowed Russian forces to use its territory as a forward staging area, the ally that Putin considered so reliable he didn't bother asking permission before moving troops there, suddenly, explicitly, unmistakably refusing to allow Russian military forces on Belarusian soil. The implications of this rupture extend far beyond 2,000 trucks sitting idle at a border crossing. Satellite imagery from Planet Labs captured the extraordinary scene on November 4th. The convoy stretches from the border checkpoint back through Russian territory in a nearly straight line along the M1 highway, visible from space as a dark ribbon of military vehicles that intelligence analysts estimate represents approximately 15% of Russia's remaining mobile logistics capacity. These aren't just trucks. This is the transportation infrastructure that keeps Russian military operations supplied, that moves ammunition to artillery units, that delivers fuel to mechanized formations. This convoy represents weeks of careful logistics planning, the consolidation of vehicles from across Western Russia, the concentration of resources that the Russian military desperately needs to sustain operations in Ukraine, and it's sitting motionless because Lukashenko said no. This is not a story about traffic management or diplomatic protocol. This is about the fracturing of the last meaningful alliance Russia has left, happening in real time, with erection in part incisive lifus, speed and visibility that suggests something fundamental has shifted in how even Russia's most dependent client states calculate their interests. Now, if you're watching this thinking this is just another story about complicated relationships between authoritarian leaders, about disputes that will be resolved through backroom negotiations and face-saving compromises, I need you to understand something crucial before we go any further. What we're witnessing tonight is not merely one dictator inconveniencing another. What we're seeing is the visible collapse of Russia's remaining geopolitical leverage, the moment when even the leaders who depend entirely on Russian support for their political survival start calculating that aligning with Moscow costs more than it's worth. Belarus blocking Russian military vehicles isn't just a tactical setback. It's a strategic catastrophe that reveals how thoroughly Russia's position has deteriorated. And yet here's what makes this so extraordinary. Even as 2,000 Russian trucks sit blocked at the border, even as commercial satellite imagery makes this standoff visible to anyone with internet access, Russian state media has mentioned the situation exactly 0 times. Not once. The convoy doesn't exist in Russian official discourse. Lukashenko's decision isn't acknowledged. The rupture with Belarus remains invisible to Russian domestic audiences who are supposed to believe that Russia's alliances remain solid and that Putin's strategic vision continues unfolding according to plan. The gap between what Russian citizens are told and what the rest of the world can see has never been wider, never been more haunting in its implications. And tonight we're going to examine exactly how we got here, what it means for Russia's ability to sustain its war in Ukraine, and why Lukashenko, of all people, decided that the cost of continued alignment with Putin had finally become unbearable. To understand why Lukashenko blocking Russian military forces matters so profoundly, we need to understand the nature of the Belarus-Russia relationship and just how dependent Lukashenko has been on Putin's support. Alexander Lukashenko has ruled Belarus since 1994, 30 years of authoritarian control that makes him Europe's longest-serving dictator. For most of that period, Lukashenko played a careful balancing act, accepting Russian economic subsidies and security guarantees while maintaining enough independence to occasionally frustrate Moscow's demands. But that balance collapsed in August 2020, when massive protests erupted across Belarus following a blatantly fraudulent presidential election. Hundreds of thousands of Belarusians took to the streets demanding Lukashenko's removal. The protests were sustained, organized, and genuinely threatened his hold on power. Lukashenko's security forces responded with mass arrests, torture, and systematic brutality documented by human rights organizations that horrified the international community. European nations imposed sanctions. The United States cut diplomatic ties. Lukashenko was becoming an international pariah. Here's the second hook. Putin saved him. Russia provided the financial support, the political backing, the security assistance, and the propaganda machinery that allowed Lukashenko to survive. Russian state media portrayed the protesters as Western-backed extremists. Russian security services helped Belarusian forces track opposition leaders. Russian banks provided credit when Western sanctions cut off other financing. Putin met with Lukashenko multiple times, each meeting a public display of support designed to demonstrate that Russia would not allow regime change in Belarus. Lukashenko understood the message perfectly. His survival depended entirely on Putin's continued support. He owed Putin everything. That debt became explicit when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Belarus allowed Russian forces to use its territory as a staging area for the assault on Kyiv. Russian troops, tanks, and artillery moved through Belarus and attacked northern Ukraine from Belarusian soil. Lukashenko didn't just permit this, he actively facilitated it, providing logistics support, allowing Russian forces to use Belarusian military bases, coordinating with Russian commanders. Belarus became complicit in the invasion, and Lukashenko became complicit in whatever consequences followed. The relationship wasn't merely cooperative, it was subordinate. Belarus had become, in every practical sense, a Russian client state whose foreign policy was dictated by Moscow's needs. Think about that trajectory. In August 2020, Lukashenko was a leader desperately clinging to power, saved only by Putin's intervention. By February 2022, he was allowing his country to be used as a launchpad for a war of aggression against a neighbor. The progression seemed irreversible. Lukashenko had tied his fate so completely to Russia's that reversing course appeared impossible. Every strategic analyst assumed Belarus would remain Russia's most reliable ally because Lukashenko had no alternative. And yet, 32 months later, here we are, Belarusian border guards turning away 2,000 Russian military trucks on Lukashenko's personal orders. Between February 2022 and November 2024, something changed. Multiple somethings, actually. Russia's quick victory in Ukraine, the victory Putin promised and Lukashenko counted on, never materialized. The war dragged on, Russian casualties mounted, Western sanctions intensified. And crucially for Belarus, international isolation deepened. Belarusian companies lost access to European markets. The Belarusian economy contracted by 12% in 2023. Ordinary Belarusians experienced shortages and price increases directly traceable to their country's role in Russia's war. Lukashenko had bet everything on Russia winning quickly, on sanctions being temporary, on the international community accepting the new reality and moving on. None of that happened. And yet, throughout this period, Lukashenko continued publicly supporting Russia, continued allowing Russian forces to use Belarusian territory, continued parroting Kremlin propaganda about Ukrainian Nazis and Western aggression, right up until November 3rd, 2024, when he suddenly, shockingly, didn't. The shift wasn't gradual. It was absolute. The question everyone is asking is, what changed? What finally pushed Lukashenko to do something that would infuriate Putin and potentially cost him the Russian support his survival depends on? Now let's examine what actually happened on November 3rd. Because the operational details reveal something extraordinary about how this decision was made and implemented. The Russian convoy in question wasn't a small logistics resupply operation. According to analysis by the Institute for the Study of War based on satellite imagery and ground-level photographs, the 2,000 vehicles included approximately 340 heavy transport trucks carrying 152 millimeters artillery shells, ammunition that Russian forces are expending at rates far exceeding Russian production capacity. Another 180 trucks carried food supplies, medical equipment, and winter clothing intended for Russian troops as winter approaches. The convoy included 47 fuel tankers carrying diesel and aviation fuel. There were 120 armored personnel carriers, 85 mobile artillery systems, and numerous command and communications vehicles. This was a major military movement representing months of logistics planning and resource consolidation. Think about the preparation this required. You don't assemble 2,000 military vehicles overnight. Russian logistics officers had been planning this convoy for weeks, coordinating with transportation commands across Western Russia, consolidating vehicles and supplies from multiple bases, organizing the movement in a way that wouldn't completely disrupt other operations. The convoy represented a significant investment of Russia's already strained logistics capability, and it was supposed to be routine. Russian military forces had been transiting through Belarus continuously since February 2022. There was no indication this convoy would be treated differently. Here's the third hook. Lukashenko didn't just deny entry to the convoy. He deployed Belarusian military forces to physically block the border crossing. Satellite imagery from November 3rd and 4th shows Belarusian armored vehicles positioned across the M1 highway at the border checkpoint, concrete barriers erected, and what appears to be anti-tank obstacles placed to prevent any attempt to force passage. This wasn't a bureaucratic decision communicated through diplomatic channels. This was a military operation designed to physically prevent Russian forces from entering Belarus, implemented with a show of force that suggests Lukashenko anticipated potential Russian attempts to ignore his orders and cross anyway. According to intercepted communications analyzed by Ukrainian military intelligence and shared with Western partners, Russian convoy commanders attempted to negotiate with Belarusian border guards for over 6 hours on November 3rd. The conversations, described in leaked intelligence summaries, reportedly included Russian officers invoking their military cooperation agreements, referencing Putin's personal relationship with Lukashenko, and eventually making what sources characterized as threats about consequences. None of it worked. Belarusian guards had clear orders from Lukashenko himself: no Russian military vehicles enter Belarus. Period. By November 4th, the situation had escalated to direct communication between Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov and his Belarusian counterpart, Viktor Krenin. That conversation, according to sources familiar with the exchange, lasted 19 minutes and ended with the Belarusian Defense Minister simply stating that President Lukashenko's orders were final and non-negotiable. Russian forces would not be permitted to transit Belarus. The border would remain closed to military traffic. If Russia wanted to move supplies to its forces operating near the Ukrainian border, it would need to find alternative routes that added hundreds of kilometers to the journey and required navigating logistics infrastructure that was already operating beyond capacity. The immediate impact was visible within hours. Russian artillery units operating in northeastern Ukraine began reporting ammunition shortages by November 5th. Fuel deliveries to mechanized formations were delayed. Medical supplies that were supposed to reach field hospitals didn't arrive. The blocked convoy wasn't just an inconvenience. It represented a significant percentage of the logistics flow that keeps Russian military operations supplied. Cutting off that flow, even temporarily, creates cascading effects throughout Russia's entire military operation. And yet, as these consequences mounted, Russian state media maintained complete silence. Not one mention of the blocked convoy, not one acknowledgement of the dispute with Belarus, not one explanation for why 2,000 military vehicles were sitting idle at a border that was supposed to be open to Russian forces. The hollowness of Russian propaganda has rarely been more visible than in this conspicuous absence, the decision to simply pretend that a major strategic setback isn't happening rather than attempt to explain it. Let's talk about what this means for ordinary people, both in Belarus and in Russia, because geopolitical ruptures have human costs that extend beyond military logistics. In Belarus, public reaction to Lukashenko's decision has been extraordinarily muted, but that silence itself is revealing. Belarusian independent media outlets, operating from exile after being shut down by Lukashenko's regime, have reported a surge in private social media discussions among Belarusians, expressing cautious hope that perhaps their country is finally distancing itself from Russia's war. One Belarusian woman, identified only as Natalia for security reasons, told the exile publication Charter 97, "For 3 years, we've watched our country become complicit in this horror." Maybe finally Lukashenko realizes we can't keep following Russia into isolation and economic collapse. I never thought I'd say this, but I actually hope he stands firm. Think about what that represents. Belarusians who spent years opposing Lukashenko, who protested against his rigged elections, who were beaten and imprisoned by his security forces, are now cautiously hoping he maintains this confrontation with Putin. The enemy of my enemy isn't exactly a friend. But when your country has been pulled into a catastrophic war by a more powerful neighbor, any sign of independence from that neighbor represents hope, even when it comes from a dictator you despise. Here's the fourth hook. The economic implications for Belarus of continued alignment with Russia have become unsustainable. Belarus's GDP contracted 12% in 2023. But preliminary figures for 2024 suggest the situation is worsening. The World Bank estimates Belarus's economy has shrunk another 8% this year. Unemployment has risen to levels not seen since the 1992 collapse. The Belarusian ruble has lost 41% of its value against the dollar since February 2022. International sanctions connected to Belarus's role in facilitating Russia's invasion have cut off access to Western technology, spare parts, and financial systems that Belarusian industries depend on. Every month that Belarus remains tied to Russia's war is another month of economic deterioration that Lukashenko can't hide from his population. Russian citizens whose sons and husbands are serving in units affected by the blocked convoy are experiencing a different kind of consequence. The ammunition that didn't arrive means artillery batteries are firing fewer missions. The fuel that didn't get delivered means mechanized units are more vulnerable to Ukrainian counterattacks. The medical supplies that were delayed mean wounded soldiers wait longer for treatment. These aren't abstract, strategic considerations. These are life and death implications for Russian soldiers whose government promised them victory and whose leaders failed to maintain the alliance that was supposed to ensure their supplies kept flowing. On November 7th, a Russian military wife posted on a Telegram channel used by families of soldiers serving in Ukraine. Her husband, she wrote, had called from the front line, saying his unit had been rationing ammunition for 3 days because expected resupplies hadn't arrived. She asked if anyone knew why. Other families reported similar stories. The post was quickly deleted, presumably by Russian authorities monitoring the channel, but screenshots circulated. The resilience of truth, its stubborn refusal to stay hidden even when governments try to suppress it, manifests in these small acts of desperate communication from people seeking answers their government won't provide. And yet, even as these human consequences accumulate, Lukashenko faces a calculation that every authoritarian eventually confronts. At what point does survival require breaking with the patron who kept you in power? For 30 years, Lukashenko navigated this question by never fully committing to either Russia or the West, maintaining enough independence to avoid complete subordination. He lost that option in 2020 when he became dependent on Putin's support. He's trying to reclaim it now, at the worst possible moment, by blocking Russian military convoys. Whether that gamble succeeds or costs him, everything remains to be seen. Let's examine the psychological dimension of what's happening between Putin and Lukashenko right now, because the personal relationship between these two authoritarian leaders has always been complex and is now clearly fracturing. Putin and Lukashenko have known each other for over 20 years. The relationship has always been transactional rather than genuinely warm. Putin views Lukashenko as a useful buffer between Russia and NATO, while Lukashenko views Putin as a necessary source of economic and security support. But the relationship has also been characterized by mutual contempt, barely concealed beneath diplomatic pleasantries. Putin considers Lukashenko unsophisticated and erratic. Lukashenko resents being treated as a subordinate rather than an equal. For years, that tension was manageable because their interests aligned enough that personal dislike didn't prevent cooperation. Here's the fifth hook. Everything changed when Lukashenko became completely dependent on Putin's support after the 2020 protests. The balance of power shifted decisively. Putin started making demands use of Belarusian territory, forgot by the Ukraine invasion, Belarus's participation in joint military exercises, coordination of propaganda messaging that Lukashenko couldn't refuse. The relationship became explicitly hierarchical. Putin gave orders, Lukashenko complied. And with each act of compliance, Lukashenko's room for maneuver decreased. By early 2024, Western intelligence assessments described Belarus as functioning essentially as a Russian province, with Lukashenko serving as a governor rather than an independent head of state. Think about what that does to someone like Lukashenko. He's ruled Belarus for 30 years, survived multiple challenges to his power, crafted an identity as a strongman leader who bows to no one. Being reduced to Putin's subordinate represents not just a political setback, but a psychological humiliation. According to diplomatic sources cited by European media outlets, Lukashenko became increasingly bitter in private conversations with foreign visitors throughout 2024, making comments about being taken for granted and being used without respect. The blocking of the Russian convoy on November 3rd may represent the moment when accumulated resentment finally overcame rational calculation about where his interests lie. Intercepted communications between Russian officials in the days following the border closure paint a picture of genuine shock at Lukashenko's decision. One conversation between Russian presidential administration officials, obtained by German intelligence and reported by Der Spiegel, includes one official saying, "He actually did it. I didn't think he'd dare." The response, "Neither did the president. We're trying to determine if this is negotiating leverage or actual rebellion." That uncertainty whether Lukashenko is engaging in brinksmanship or making a genuine break seems to pervade Russian official thinking. Putin apparently can't quite believe that the leader he saved in 2020 would risk everything by defying him now. And yet, here we are. 2,000 trucks remain blocked. Lukashenko hasn't reversed his decision. Putin hasn't forced a resolution through economic pressure or military threats, or if he's tried, those efforts have failed. The standoff continues, and every day it continues further damages both Russia's military operations and Putin's reputation as a leader who controls his sphere of influence. The historical parallels are haunting. Napoleon thought his conquered territories would remain loyal because he'd granted them subordinate positions in his empire. Many rebelled the moment he showed weakness. Hitler believed the occupied territories would provide resources and support indefinitely. Resistance emerged everywhere. Putin assumed Belarus would stay aligned because Lukashenko owed him everything. Now Russian military trucks sit blocked at the Belarusian border, proof that dependency doesn't guarantee loyalty when the dependent party calculates that breaking free offers better odds than continuing to follow a declining power into isolation and economic ruin. Now let's zoom out and examine what Belarus blocking Russian military forces means for the broader geopolitical landscape, because this rupture has implications that extend far beyond two countries' bilateral relationship. For Russia, losing reliable access to Belarus represents a strategic catastrophe with multiple dimensions. Geographically, Belarus provided Russia with its closest staging area to central Ukraine and its buffer zone between Russian territory and NATO members Poland and Lithuania. Losing that access means Russian forces must operate from positions farther from Ukrainian targets and closer to Russian infrastructure that becomes vulnerable to Ukrainian strikes. Economically, Belarus was one of the few countries that continued trading normally with Russia despite Western sanctions, providing access to goods that couldn't be obtained elsewhere. That commercial relationship now becomes uncertain if political tensions remain high. Here's the sixth hook. More broadly, Belarus turning on Russia sends a signal to every other Russian client, state and ally about the reliability of Russian partnerships. If even Lukashenko, who literally owes his political survival to Putin, can decide that alignment with Russia has become too costly, what does that tell leaders in Armenia, Kazakhstan, or Kyrgyzstan about the value of Russian security guarantees or the wisdom of staying in Moscow's orbit? The message is clear. Russia can't protect you anymore. Russia can't make you prosperous. Russia can only drag you down. Better to distance yourself now before you're completely pulled under. Think about how Central Asian leaders are processing this moment. For decades, they've balanced between Russia and China, accepting security cooperation from Moscow while expanding economic ties with Beijing. Belarus blocking Russian military forces demonstrates that even the most dependent client can break away when the costs of loyalty become unbearable. Kazakhstan has already been quietly diversifying its trade routes to avoid Russian territory. Armenia has been exploring security arrangements with Western partners after Russia failed to defend Armenian territory against Azerbaijan. Kyrgyzstan has been negotiating infrastructure deals with China that bypass Russian involvement. Every one of these moves represents an erosion of Russian influence that Lukashenko's defiance accelerates. The European Union is watching closely and drawing conclusions about whether this represents an opportunity for engagement with Belarus. For 4 years, the EU has maintained strict sanctions on the Lukashenko regime because of the 2020 election fraud and subsequent human rights abuses. But if Belarus is genuinely distancing itself from Russia's war, does that create space for reconsidering some of those sanctions in ways that encourage Lukashenko to continue moving away from Moscow? The calculations are complex. The EU doesn't want to reward Lukashenko's authoritarianism, but it does want to encourage any development that weakens Russia's strategic position. How to balance those objectives remains an open question that European foreign ministers are actively debating. The United States faces similar dilemmas. American intelligence agencies have reportedly provided real-time information to Ukraine about Russian military movements through Belarus throughout the war. If Belarus is no longer allowing those movements, does that change the U.S. assessment of Belarus's role in the conflict? Do American officials quietly encourage Lukashenko to maintain his stand against Putin, even though Lukashenko remains a dictator who imprisoned opposition leaders and falsified elections? The pragmatic calculation that Belarus defying Russia serves Western interests runs up against principled objections to normalizing relations with authoritarian regimes. How that tension resolves will significantly impact whether Lukashenko can successfully navigate independence from Russia without collapsing economically. But here's what we must acknowledge clearly. None of this makes Belarus suddenly democratic or Lukashenko suddenly respectable. He remains the authoritarian leader who rigged elections, who ordered brutal crackdowns on protesters, who facilitated Russia's invasion of Ukraine for 32 months before changing course. Whatever Lukashenko's current motivations, whether genuine strategic recalculation or desperate attempt to preserve his power as Russia weakens his past actions and continuing repression of dissent in Belarus, remain unforgivable. The resilience of the Belarusian opposition, which continues organizing and advocating for democracy despite years of persecution, deserves recognition separate from any tactical assessment of Lukashenko's current maneuvers against Putin. And yet the geopolitical reality remains. Russia's last reliable